Gulliver in Lilliput, retold from the original by Jonathan Swift. Once upon a time there lived a handsome man called Gulliver, who was an apprentice to a doctor in London. But he also loved sea travel, and one day the captain of a ship called the Antelope asked him if he would like to sail to the South Sea. Gulliver agreed, and at first the voyage went very well. They sailed along on the calm blue seas with fair winds behind them until one day a violent storm began to rage. It sent huge waves lashing against the sides of the ship and left the crew completely at the mercy of the waves and the powerful wind. As the wind continued to howl and the waves kept on lashing, the ship was driven onto a rock and it split in two. Gulliver climbed into the lifeboat with 6 of the crew, and they rowed away from the big ship with all their might. They struggled on in their little boat, battling against the storm, but eventually the little boat was dashed to pieces, and only Gulliver escaped. In desperation, he swam until luckily he reached the shore. When Gulliver staggered to his feet, he looked around for any signs of life. "Is there anybody there?" he shouted. There was no reply, so he tried again. "Is there anybody there? I'm tired and hungry and in a land far away from my home. Help me, please." Still there was no reply. By now, due to lack of food and his exhausting adventures, he was absolutely worn out, so he lay down on the shore and was soon fast asleep. Gulliver had the soundest sleep he had ever had in his life, and when he woke up it was just daylight. He decided to get up and explore this strange land, but when he tried to move, he found that his arms and legs were fastened to the ground on either side. His long, thick hair was also tied down. "What is happening to me?" cried Gulliver, and as he spoke he heard a curious murmuring noise around him, although he could see nothing at all. Then suddenly Gulliver felt hundreds of pinpricks all over his body, and he saw a host of little arrows flying over him. At the same time he felt a tickling sensation on his chest, and looking down he saw the tiniest little person you could ever imagine. He was standing on a ladder and couldn't have been more than 6 inches tall. He was dressed in purple robes and wore a simple crown on his head. "I am the Emperor of Lilliput," said the little man. "I command you to untie this man's head, legs and arms, but make sure you chain up his feet. We don't know if he can be trusted yet," said the Emperor to his tiny subjects. Slowly Gulliver sat up and looked around him. He was surrounded by little people, none of them more than 6 inches high, and all of them looking very worried. And as he looked further, he realized he was in a land where everything was in miniature. "In all my years of travelling on the seas, I have never seen such a fantastic place as this," said Gulliver. "Don't worry, my little friends," he added. "I will do you no harm. I came to this land by chance as my ship was wrecked and most of the crew killed in the cruel storm." Then his curiosity got the better of him, and he picked 2 of the little people up. The poor little things shook with fear. "Put us down, you brute!" they shouted. "Have no fear, little ones. I am a doctor who has been parted from my ship, the Antelope. Believe me, I won't hurt you." "But tell me all about your strange little land and your customs," said Gulliver. So they told him all about life in the land of Lilliput. The people of Lilliput were just as amazed by Gulliver as he was by them. They had never seen a man of his size before. The Emperor was delighted by Gulliver. "I would like you to come to the party we are planning tonight," he said grandly. "You can be our special guest." "That would be a great honour, your Majesty," said Gulliver, and he joined in the procession of people marching towards the party. The Emperor's personal guards marched at the head of the procession, while the Emperor, his other guests, and the ordinary people followed on behind. There was a wonderful party atmosphere. Even the guards were laughing and joking as they marched along. Gulliver's feet were unchained, and he walked behind all the little folk. He had to take extra small steps so he didn't step on any of them. Suddenly everyone started clapping and jumping up and down with delight, because they were approaching the main square, and this was where the party was being held. The little people were getting so excited and making such a noise that Gulliver had to cover his ears for a few minutes. To reach the main square, the procession had to pass by 2 towers that were as thin and tall as needles. The square itself was no bigger than a tea tray. The party was in full swing when Gulliver arrived. Acrobats were performing, bands were playing, and everyone was having fun. Gulliver knelt down so he had his nose on the same level as the little tightrope that had been set up for the acrobats. The thread they were balanced on was as thin as a human hair, and they were holding long pins in their hands to help them keep their balance. All the little onlookers were cheering and clapping at the amazing feats they were performing. "Help! I've lost my balance!" shouted one of the little acrobats suddenly. But he was in luck. Gulliver caught him in the palm of his hand and lifted him back onto the tightrope. "Hooray for Gulliver!" shouted the audience. "Thank you, kind giant, for saving one of our friends." Gulliver smiled at the audience. "It gives me great pleasure to help you," he said. "In all my years of travelling on the seas, I have never met any people who are as brave as you." "Three cheers for Gulliver!" shouted the Emperor. "Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray!" With his gallant gesture, Gulliver had won the hearts of the people. The little people of Lilliput were keen to repay Gulliver for his kindness, and one hot day when Gulliver was relaxing on the beach, they were able to do this. Gulliver was sitting, looking out to sea and thinking of home, when a sudden breeze blew his hat off and whisked it into the sea. "That's my lucky hat!" shouted Gulliver. "If I don't get it back, my good luck will run out." A group of little fishermen who were standing nearby heard Gulliver's plea and soon thought of a clever way of rescuing Gulliver's hat. They swam out to sea, attached string to the hat, and used tiny horses to drag it back to the shore. Moving a big hat like this was not an easy task for the horses, but they managed to swim back to the shore with it. When they got the hat back onto the shore, the fishermen all stood around huffing and puffing as Gulliver ran across the beach to pick up his hat. "Thank you," he said, "for returning my lucky hat," and he put it firmly back on his head. Several days later, Gulliver was relaxing on the beach again, when suddenly he heard a lot of shouting coming from the sea. "What's all the noise about?" asked Gulliver, as he looked round and saw the Emperor and all the people of Lilliput looking anxiously out to sea. "The Emperor of Blefuscu has sent his fleet to attack Lilliput," shouted the Emperor. "Please can you help us to drive them away, Gulliver?" Gulliver sat with his head in his hands for a few moments, while he tried to think of the best possible plan to help his little friends. Suddenly he leapt up and shouted, "I know how to get rid of our enemies." He took a large hook and attached it to a long piece of rope. Then he waded into the sea and attached a piece of string to the bow of each ship. "It's a giant! It's a giant!" shouted the enemies, and they all swam back to their shores. Gulliver then attached all the strings to his hook and pulled the boats into Lilliput. Everyone clapped and cheered. "To repay you for returning peace to our land, we would like you to be the guest of honor at the biggest banquet that Lilliput has ever thrown," proclaimed the Emperor. On the day of the banquet, the Emperor commanded that several ladders should be set up in front of Gulliver. The ladders allowed the Lilliputians to carry food to him, and the food was certainly amazing. There were legs and shoulders of mutton that were smaller than the wings of a bird, pigs tinier than Gulliver's fingernails, and whole fruits smaller than an orange pip. Although the portions were small, there was more than enough for him to eat. There was plenty of drink for him too, but the beer was served in such tiny glasses that Gulliver needed to drink several barrels at a time to quench his thirst. By the end of the meal, Gulliver was so full that he could hardly move. He turned to the Emperor and said, "That was the best meal I have ever tasted in my life. Thank you so much." Gulliver felt that he needed a little exercise after his feasting, so he wandered off to the beach for a little walk. As Lilliput was such a small place, he only had to walk a few paces to get to the beach. He began to stroll up and down, and when he looked out to sea, he saw, to his amazement, a large, upturned shape floating in the water. "That's certainly not a hat," he said to himself. "In fact, that looks like a little boat. If only I could get it to the shore, I might be able to sail back to my own country in it." Gulliver wanted to swim out to sea straight away to have a closer look. "It's not a good idea to swim straight after you have eaten. Leave the boat until morning. It's stuck on a rock anyway," said one of the fishermen. So Gulliver took his advice and waited. In the morning, all the little people of Lilliput gathered on the beach and put their fleet of ships to sea to help Gulliver drag the boat back to shore. When they had the boat back on the shore, the Lilliputians set up a system of ladders and pulleys so they could reach the boat. Then they set to work to make it seaworthy again. They all pulled together. Some did the painting, while others mended the holes in the wood with their miniature hammers and nails. They worked for days and days until the boat was finished and looking good. "At last I'll be able to sail back to my own country and see all my old friends again," said Gulliver. "We'll be sad to see you go," cried his little helpers. Later that day Gulliver put to sea and waved the sad goodbye to the Emperor and his subjects. "This has been the most exciting adventure I've ever had," he called. "But it is a long time since I saw my home, and I must return. But do not worry, I will not tell anyone the name of your land, so you will never be invaded by giants like me." And with a final wave, he sailed away. The end.